slaves who ran away from other countries surrounding Israel were allowed to find refuge in the land of Israel. They were allowed to settle in any of Israel's cities, but in surrounding nations, the Hittites, the Babylonians, and so forth, they had extradition treaties to send back those runaway slaves to their harsh masters. And again, this is something on pain of death. So as you look at this, you see that there is a very different world going on. In fact, if you injured your servant, that servant could be let go. He could be set free without any sort of payment, continuing on. So again, a far different matter when it comes to antebellum slavery here in the United States.
Hi, welcome to the Church Split. My name is Will, and you guys know what we do here. We help you escape your church's echo chamber and all that good jazz. But you're going to hear that intro again here in a second because it's all part of the next video that we're merging together in this video. The reason for this, and I know I'm wearing a Spider-Man bathrobe. I look like a hot mess, and that's okay. Our capital was just stormed. 2021 is off to a wild start. Man, good grief. So happy New Year to all of you out there. Maybe will 2021, ask in the comments, will 2021 be worse or better than 2020? That's the ultimate question. But real quick, the reason why I'm doing this quick intro before the rest of the video plays is after recording this with Dr. Paul Copan, we replayed the video on our end, and apparently somehow the audio got messed up, and there's some audio clips that kind of sometimes stutter throughout, but it's not just that. Apparently, it moved my audio in our audio file ahead of his audio sometimes. So what ends up happening is I am constantly cutting him off in the audio. I swear, contrary to popular opinion, I am not that rude. So if when you hear that, you're going to hear that it's a great interview, honestly. It's actually one of the ones I felt really went naturally. Dr. Copan is so efficient at giving quick, raw answers at stuff. So I hope this is helpful for you. But just so you are aware that one of our best interviews also went kind of complicated on the audio end. So I am constantly cutting him off during this interview. So I'm not that rude, but I felt like you guys should be aware. That way, when you're listening to it, you're not like, why is Will jumping the gun every 5 seconds? That's why. It's not that often because generally speaking, it's him talking, but it's usually when I'm chiming in to ask a question, I come in like a second too early, and then it just sounds like I'm cutting him off. So anyway, hope this interview is helpful. Let's get the show on the road. Enough about all this intro stuff, and time to get to the actual meat of what we do here. Hi, welcome to the Church Split. My name is Will, and you guys know what we do here. We help you escape your church's echo chamber to look at things biblically and perhaps learn something new, especially when it comes to Scripture. So today we have a special guest with us. We have Dr. Paul Copan, and he is author of many books, and I definitely recommend them. But my favorite book is this one right here. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, is God a Moral Monster? It is a fantastic book that deals with a lot of atheistic objections to the Old Testament. So please check that out if you haven't, or any of his other books, including his other one, which is It's True for You but Not for Me. That's a good book. It's also one of those ones that deal with a famous objection that people say nowadays. I really love talking to people who take their work seriously, who actually try to deal with these objections and not just appeal to something else, and they actually are willing to get down in the dirt and get nitty-gritty with some of this stuff. And so would you mind, just for people who don't know who you are, would you be able to tell a little bit about yourself, your background, and what got you into apologetics?
Sure. I have grew up in a pastor's home. My father came from the Ukraine. My mother from Latvia. My father's my grandfather, died as a result of starvation symptoms because of the Stalinist famine that was put upon the people. Wow. So my father was without my own father was without a father from the age of 6 or so onward, or 10, or actually 7 or so onward, and so he came to faith in Christ during the Second World War in Europe, and was actually baptized in this frozen river while Soviet tanks were blasting in the background. So it was a very dramatic awakening here in the face of evil. He's one who found hope in the gospel, and so that he had a joy. My mother too, very joyful Christians despite the harrowing experience they had in World War II Europe. And so I grew up in that home, loving environment, wonderful parents, and large family, 7 children in our family. And I always was interested in scripture. When I was in high school, took an interest in apologetics, became exposed to that, and found it very helpful as I went along. And I was planning on doing ministry work, Christian ministry. Went to Columbia International University undergrad, and then went to Trinity Seminary. Was going to get a Master of Divinity degree, and then I took a course in philosophy that first semester, and it was with Stuart epistemology, and Stuart Hackett had been a strong influence on William Lane Craig, who was also teaching at Trinity Seminary. And so that was, I ended up getting a Master of Arts in Philosophy of Religion while at Trinity. And so in addition to my MDiv, so that really set me on my way, ended up getting a PhD in philosophy. And then I've been teaching at Palm Beach Atlantic University in our School of Ministry. We're starting up a Master of Arts in Philosophy of Religion.
Oh, wow, okay.
In the fall. So Paul Gould is with us,
that's cool.
And another fellow Christian philosopher. So we're excited about the program that's developing. So anyway, but that's kind of a brief run through. But I would say that it was very helpful for me while I was in high school to come to terms with the objectivity of the Christian faith. I realized, wow, I don't have to believe just because my parents believe in Jesus.
Right.
I can embrace it on my own as something that's objectively true and true for all people.
Yeah, I think that's a huge thing for me when I got into apologetics was this isn't just something I have to take on blind faith. It's something I can trust with a certain amount of certainty at least. But, definitely something that, like you said, is objectively true for all people. And the more you look into it, it's really a deep well that just kind of keeps going. So Absolutely. I really appreciate that. So, well, thank you for telling us a little bit about yourself. That whole story about being baptized with tanks and stuff in the background that's intense. That puts I thought I fell into my baptismal pool, and I thought that was intense, let alone that. So, anyway, so you ended up being you ended up getting involved in, obviously, apologetics, and then you wrote this book, Is God a Moral Monster? So if you don't mind me asking, why in the world did you choose to tackle the Old Testament?
Well, I became exposed to the new atheists, people like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens, and I saw, again, in the wake of 9/11 and some of their writings that not only attacked Islam, but all religion as being evil, as being toxic, as poisoning everything and so forth. And I looked at their arguments on the God of the Old Testament, and it's not as though there aren't some challenges, but I realized that they were really taking things out of context. They're using a lot of slogans that were actually distorting what the scripture said, say about slavery and or warfare in the Old Testament. And so I wrote an article that responded to some of these objections, and then that kind of snowballed into a book that turned into Is God a Moral Monster? And then that developed into a book specifically on violence in the Old Testament that I co-authored with Matthew Flanagan, who's from New Zealand, theologian, philosopher, and a great mind. So we really had a great time teaming up on that. But so it kind of mushroomed into that, and I've been writing on various books related to violence in the Old Testament, editing and contributing to other books. And I do have a new book that'll be coming out in actually about a year and a half or so, but it's going to be on kind of a complement to the book Is God a Moral Monster, tentatively entitled Is God a Vindictive Bully, which looks at things like the imprecatory Psalms, the Elisha and the bears, the firstborn in Egypt, and so forth. So tackling some of these tough questions, but again, like a complement or a supplement to what I've already written.
So in other words, they need to read this book if they want to enjoy that other one coming out soon, right? Another reason to read it.
There you go. There'll be self-standing volumes, but yeah, it's they fit
Gotcha. Okay,
together.
well, that's really helpful because I've noticed a lot of Christian apologists actually don't usually go. A lot of them, focus on the proofs of the resurrection, like Dr. Gary Habermas, or they talk about, or William Lane Craig's famous Kalam cosmological argument, things along that nature. So it makes it unique to me the fact that somebody decided that they were going to take the main objections with from the neo-atheists. And so, real quick, before we get into some of the specific things that you discuss in the book that people could learn some here, but then learn more there. What are some things like that you notice with the neo-atheists? What was it that, outside of taking scriptures out of context, what is it that neo-atheism that you think gets wrong the most when trying to have a conversation with Christianity?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, the neo-atheists, you can lay out certain arguments and build your case, give a context for things, but they'll resort to the same kinds of slogans without really engaging at a deeper level. I think this is particularly true of Richard Dawkins, who, he will just parrot the same sorts of lines, no matter how many objections have been written against him, even criticisms coming from those who are atheists and agnostics, like Michael Ruse, who endorsed a book by the Christian theologian Alistair McGrath, who, in his book, The Dawkins Delusion, Michael Ruse, this agnostic, said, Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, makes me embarrassed to be an atheist.
I remember that quote, yeah.
You've got that kind of, you realize, wow, somebody is really tone deaf here. And I would say that there have been philosophical atheists, people who reasoned well, people who had depth to their arguments in the academy. But this new version of atheism really doesn't engage in any depth on some of these arguments and objections. I mean, to some degree, Daniel Dennett does, but it seems like it's the same old arguments just being recycled, the same old slogans, but without really taking criticisms from a breadth of perspectives, very seriously.
Yeah, that's what I've noticed that too. As I've only been involved in apologetics for probably about 6 years at this point, and I was just serving as a lead pastor, and I really got passionate about it. That's what I do. So every time I read The God Delusion, and I was just kind of shocked at so much of the misappropriation on so many various areas. So I agree with that, and I hope other people can they should look into it if they haven't heard of it. So anyway, real quick, so let's go ahead and I guess get into some of the things that you discuss in your book. I mean, there's a lot of vitriol that is thrown at God from the Old Testament, and there's a number of things we could talk about, but I'm just going to go kind of in some sequential order that I had in mind when I approached you. One of the biggest things that people accuse the Bible of is being sexist and misogynistic, and it hates women and all this stuff. They pay the bride price. Women are treated like property, especially in Israel in the Old Testament. So would you be able to just kind of explain a little bit more of what that context was and how that actually worked in Israel, things along that nature?
Sure. Yeah. In fact, in this upcoming volume, I will address some of some more of that, because in recent scholarship, someone like Carol Myers of Duke University, she had been the president of the Society of Biblical Literature, and so well regarded. She wrote a book called Rediscovering Eve, in which she said that in ancient Israel, things were, women had their own sphere of power. They had their own realm of kind of wielding power. They had their own guilds of music. They had their own, various guilds of serving in the temple. They also, when you look at Proverbs 31, where you look at this woman who is the model of wisdom, she is someone who works. She assesses a field and she buys it. She is an entrepreneur. Making all sorts of garments and so forth that are going to be sold. She is someone who is very productive and industrious in her work, and there's no kind of husband to kind of monitor her. He's off at the gate of the city doing his own stuff, this woman is really seizing the day and doing things, and you get the very strong impression that this is a person who is a self-starter, doesn't have to have a man looking over her shoulder to make sure that she's doing things his way. She's very independently minded. And so Carol Myers, in her book Rediscovering Eve, talks about how this term patriarchy has actually kind of just been slapped on to the Old Testament. But when you look more closely, you realize that it's not at all that clear, and it's kind of using a modern term, often appropriated by those who are Marxists and other feminists even. But they've been misusing it, and now some feminists are actually reappropriating the Old Testament to show how women actually did have realms of autonomy. It wasn't a clear hierarchical structure, and so even as you look at the Old Testament, there are some passages that may strike us as odd, or where you do see males as the kind of legal point person, the head of the household, within the when he's kind of representing the home to the broader society. But yet there is still a lot of input that women have in this process, and that women have their own spheres of autonomy. So that term patriarchy should not be used. In fact, I used it in the Moral Monster book. I'm not going to be using it in this next book. Just because it's been very well scrutinized. And one Old Testament scholar, John Goldengay, says that the Israelite society was much more egalitarian than a lot of people think. And as you read between the lines, as you read the narratives and so forth, you realize, there's a lot more going on in terms of the fundamental equality of the sexes. You see it spelled out in Genesis chapter 1, male and female made in God's image. After the fall, yes, there's some things that are misappropriated. There are fallen structures and so forth. But you see within Israel, there's a general democratization of peoplehood, and women have kind of their own dignity, their own work. Human beings, they're held, equally responsible before the law. It's not that the men get away with stuff and the women have to bear the penalty. It is, both of them are guilty. You're to honor your father and your mother. You're not to honor your father and his piece of property. There is this, so you see these sorts of strands that are throughout that really give the the core of what the Old Testament is affirming. Even if there are misuses, women who are being abused and so forth, it's not as though the Bible condones that. It's simply describing that these things did happen, but it's not as though that is being met with approval.
Right, and that goes into the is-ought fallacy, right? Just because it is described in the Old Testament doesn't mean it's prescribing it, doesn't mean it ought to be so. So that's actually one of the things that I thought was interesting. I've really been studying Judaism over the past about year and a half, and really trying to understand that through the lens of someone in the 21st century, to understand ancient Judaism. And you're right, there's a lot of this mirroring of, no, they had different roles, but they all had their own sphere of autonomy. Like you said, just because he's the legal representative of his home doesn't mean suddenly it's a patriarchy where everything he says goes, where the woman is devoid of rights. In fact, they even there's even descriptions of what would happen. Some rabbis have even written about what would happen if a woman was in an abusive relationship with her husband, and how the father could basically step in with the high priest and have a conversation there. But anyway, I really appreciate that. So then the other thing is, so people talk about misogyny a lot, and really you break that down a lot, the bride price and how this all actually works. In fact, would you mind explaining the bride price real quick for just like 2 seconds?
Sure. Yeah, some people talk about this bride price, that there is a certain money that is being given during this marital transaction. It's actually a legal transaction, and that there is money that is being paid so that the woman will have security in case something happens to her husband, in case she is left. Maybe if the husband divorces her, or if the husband dies, there will be some financial security for her. So it was a way of looking out for the woman. So what some people treat as a criticism of this payment, it's actually like an insurance policy. It's having a little bit of financial security in the advent of some sort of a calamity that takes place. So it gives the woman, it basically helps those who are vulnerable in society, like women, so that they have this hedge of protection
Right,
about them.
exactly. So that's actually one of the things I noticed in general, and you lay this out well, and people should really research, really look into it, read your book. It is one of the things where a lot of those laws that people point to as sexism, actually it's the reverse. It's usually like, no, that this was the safety net, and this is why, and people just misappropriate. So the other objection that a lot of people have, in fact, when I had a young man over today that we kind of were like starting a discipleship relationship, he was asking these questions. So it's funny that we're having this conversation today. But so slavery, that is thrown around all the time. And I think when people read the word slave or servant in the Bible, they instantly think of 1700s America with Africans. So would you be able to explain a little bit of what that looked like in the Old Testament?
Sure. What we're dealing with here is indentured servitude in Israel. Basically, this happened with the colonies, where if you wanted to come to the New World, you couldn't pay for your passageway. You basically committed yourself. You signed a contract that you would work for, say, 7 years, and then once you got to the New World, and then you were free to go about as an ordinary citizen, but you had this contract, this debt hanging over your head until you worked that debt off. So there was, you were temporarily a servant in Israel, but not that this is something that was permanent. In fact, permanent servant status was not permitted for Israelites. You had a term limit on that, after which time the person had to go free. There was a 6-year period in which you worked, and then it's kind of like, think of the army or the like, where you are serving for a certain time, but you have to complete that service before you can move about in society as other people ordinarily would. You do have certain. I would say. Well, let me just say something about the word servant. The term it's a neutral term. The term servant, sometimes translated slave, the word eved has to do with a dynamic dependency relationship. That is, and Joshua, Moses are called the servant of the Lord. So it's an honorific title, actually. It's not as though this is a degrading title. But the Israelites, when you read Exodus, the Israelites were slaves in the land of Egypt. But they were to be freed, and God told Moses to tell Pharaoh, "Let my people go that they may serve me in the wilderness." So they're serving Pharaoh on the one hand, which is an oppressive kind of servitude, and God is saying, "Let them go that they will be liberated and serve me in the wilderness." So the same terminology is used, but it just depends upon the context. How is that term being used within the specific context? So there's nothing, it's more of a neutral term. It's not a negative term in itself. Also, I would say that kidnapping, which was the basis for modern day slavery, kidnapping was prohibited on penalty of death in the Old Testament. Also, there's nothing race-based about it. Also, we could add that provision was made for those who would be poor in Israel, like gleaning laws and so forth, so they wouldn't have to go into economic deprivation and thus sell themselves, in other words, contract themselves out for 6 years. Things were available to the people of Israel, or at least structures should be in place so that people could avail themselves of fruit on trees or fields that hadn't been completely harvested, so that they could benefit from the well-being of others when they were in this state of poverty. That those who are the most vulnerable, the alien, the orphan, the widow, there were laws in place so that the Israelites were to look out for the most vulnerable, that they wouldn't be taken advantage of. The same thing goes with those who are economically deprived. Provisions were made for them. And so it was not to be something harsh. In fact, slaves who ran away from other countries surrounding Israel were allowed to find refuge in the land of Israel. They were allowed to settle in any of Israel's cities, but in surrounding nations, the Hittites, the Babylonians, and so forth, they had extradition treaties to send back those runaway slaves to their harsh masters. And again, this is something on pain of death. So as you look at this, you see that there is a very different world going on. In fact, if you injured your servant, that servant could be let go. He could be set free without any sort of payment, continuing on. So again, a far different matter when it comes to antebellum slavery here in the United States. Biblical slavery, servitude was something far, far different. Yet a lot of people read this matter of slavery, and they in our modern translations, they say, "Oh, look, this is the same thing that took place in the United States." No, far from it. And so we need to make sure that we're clear
Words
on
have
that.
meaning, especially within their historical context. And that's the thing. When you're reading slave or servant, does it mean the exact same thing as you're thinking as slave or servant? And so that's one of the interesting parts is that, like you said, it's a contract. You're going out. And you're able to, that's kind of a nifty thing because it's not like you're just getting a free handout by society either. I'm on down on my luck. Great, you can put yourself in limited servitude where you're out after a certain period of time, and you still work and you earn your way. So I still think that kind of plays into that a little bit. I think that's interesting. So you touched on something, and I didn't send it to you today, but I was wondering if you'd be able to comment because you mentioned the fact that obviously kidnapping was under the pain of death. Now, a lot of people do talk about the death penalty in the Old Testament. And so how would you navigate dealing with some of that? Because one of the things I thought was interesting you did in the book, and I'll just kind of set you up and then you can hit it out of the park. But, one of the things you mentioned was that you actually compared it a lot to the similar laws in surrounding countries and how things went there. So would you mind kind of commenting a bit on the death penalty, how that worked in Israel and all that good stuff?
Sure. Yeah, let me say a couple of things. First of all, the death penalty was a maximum penalty. Basically, the only penalty that was not to be commuted to, say, some sort of a payment was when there was murder, that was intentional murder, homicide, that was something where there would be a life for life. But other practices, things that had a kind of a maximum penalty of death, could be commuted to financial payment instead. So you do have examples of death penalties, I think, like breaking the Sabbath and so forth, or cursing your parents, where this was seen as something exemplary. Where I think in the law of Moses, it's highlighted as a priority for the people of God to take these things seriously. But when you look at the actual practices of what the nation of Israel did, they, like even adultery, this was something that, though there is a maximum penalty of death, as it's treated in the historical narratives, it is not something that is given the death penalty. There might be some payment for damages or something like that, but again, that's not something that's carried out. And again, I'll make modifications of this from the Moral Monster book into this next book, that many of these harsh-sounding penalties are more illustrative. And what they're doing is they're showing these are the priorities for, say, the people of God, and and how they should live in light of these illustrations that are being given. But in the ancient Near East in general, a lot of these very severe penalties weren't going to be carried out in some sort of a literalistic sort of fashion. Rather, they were to, again, highlight some of the priorities. But what I will say is when we compare the law of Moses to that of those laws of surrounding nations, one of the things that I point out in this forthcoming book, I have 2 chapters on this, that highlights through the laws, you see a lot of the priorities that are given to benefit, say, the vulnerable in society, rather than high interest loans. You're not to punish the poor of within Israel with high interest loans. You are to allow the poor to glean and to pick fruit from trees and so forth. Again, something that was not found in ancient Near Eastern law codes surrounding Israel. you see many of these very humanizing and humanitarian laws in contrast to much more stringent laws in other surrounding nations. And also there's kind of a hierarchy in some of these other nations surrounding Israel, whereas Israel is much more democratized, that there is a fundamental equality, whether you're a king down to the peasant. There's a fundamental equality before the law, that the king can't just get away with things just because he's the king. No, he is held accountable just as the ordinary citizen is. So those are some things that I will bring out much more fully in the next book, but there are indeed many very telling contrasts. Like I said, not that they're carried out literally, and I'll give an example of this in even the Code of Hammurabi from Babylon. Someone who wants to become a surgeon, a doctor, but if his patient dies while he is under his care while in surgery, well, that person is to be punished severely. His family is to be punished, and so forth. Well, no one would go into the medical profession if those were literally carried out. They just wouldn't do it. But again, it's to show the priorities of being careful as a medical practitioner, that you don't treat your patient's health lightly, and so forth. So that's just an illustration of how that works out, and so I'll tease those things out in this forthcoming volume.
So another thing I found interesting, I have to look up the exact source on it, but I think it was if a high priest put more than 2 people to death, to the death penalty in 10 years, he was considered bloodthirsty. Even there's writings on that. I'd have to find that. It's over there on the shelf, but I'm over here. So, but it shows the fact that this wasn't something that they put people to death every single time this happened. Like, you worked it out that the case law works differently. It's like up to this, but it's really showing the priority of it. It's not like they willy-nilly just stoned everyone who could have possibly violated a small thing. In fact, we see that in the New Testament even. Otherwise, when he was healing on the Sabbath, things along that nature, they would have stoned him, but they didn't. Then again, they removed capital punishment, the Romans instead. But anyway, the other thing that comes up, so now with the death penalty thing out front, I now realize that was the better thing to segue into. The other thing that people attack the Old Testament for and attack God for is the idea of genocide, racist genocide. And, especially when it's talking about like kill the men, women, and children, and their cow and cat too. They say all these crazy things about it. And I can definitely see the concern when people read the text and not fully understand that. But would you be able to kind of explain a little bit about that?
Sure. And as I said, I give some preliminaries in the Moral Monster book, but I'll go into more detail in this next book. And also Matt Flanagan and we touch on a number of these things in our book, Did God Really Command Genocide? But let me give a few examples of how, for example, racism, kind of a genocide, is just not at all in view here. For one thing, when you look at God's command regarding the Canaanites, the Israelites came from Canaanite stock. That they were, when you read Ezekiel, your mother was an Amorite, your father a Hittite, that they came from the same people groups. In fact, if you stood an Israelite next to a Canaanite, you wouldn't be able to tell them apart in terms of their looks, their language, their dress. Maybe the way that they built their houses would be a little different, but everything else was pretty much the same. So it's not as though this is a race-based kind of a thing. And as you look at all of the peoples that are mentioned in, for example, Genesis 15, when God says that he's going to make this land available, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, and so forth, that all of those people are mentioned in often friendly or neutral terms as you read through the Old Testament. You have Caleb, who is the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, one of those peoples. You have Moses' father-in-law, who is a Kenite. You have Hittites, who are part of David's men of valor. So you have all of these people groups that are mentioned in very neutral terms without any sort of negativity associated with them. So again, it's not as though this is race-based. This is something that is fundamentally morality or behavior-based. When God is telling the Israelites to drive out the Canaanites, well, what sorts of things were they doing? Well, they're sacrificing infants. They were engaged in cult or ritual prostitution. They engaged in not only in human sacrifice, but they also engaged in incest and so forth, things that would be considered criminal in any civilized society. So when God is saying drive them out, there is a moral basis for doing so. And so, but you also have the opportunity that kind of a fundamental condition in the Old Testament is that if people turn to God, then they can find salvation, they can find hope, or they can simply leave the land. But you see Rahab doing that. You see the Gibeonites doing that. You see a group in Joshua chapter 8 where these strangers are there at the reading of the law. When Joshua's reading it, these strangers are part of the people of God. So, and you kind of see that it's not as though race separates you from the people of God, but rather it's, if you are willing to embrace the God of Israel, if you're willing to live in light of the covenant, you can become part of that people of God. There's this conditionality that's associated with it. Let me say something about the utterly destroy. That term utterly destroy is itself a problematic translation, because sometimes that term haram, utterly destroy, can be treated in other ways, like Leviticus 27, as someone who is simply set apart for service. A field can be haram. It's not destroyed or burned or something like that. An animal can be haram, but it's used for priestly service. It's not destroyed. A servant can be haram, but he is someone who goes into temple service, and but if he left that, then he would be open to vulnerable to death. So this term can be used for and as John Walton argues, has more of a sense of identity or identity removal, that for someone to be haram, like Nazi Germany, it was basically when all the symbols of Nazism, the hierarchy of Nazism, the military leaders and so forth, when they were put to death, that was basically what you had. Like haram, the identity of Nazism was removed, but you still had largely intact the German people. So there is a growing scholarship that is reaffirming this kind of identity removal. The focus in Deuteronomy 7, when it says, leave alive nothing that breathes, utterly destroy them. For one thing, as part of the rhetoric, you can utterly destroy people or leave alive nothing that breathes and have a ton of people who are surviving. But in this particular case, the word haram doesn't necessitate utter obliteration or death. In fact, God says He's going to utterly destroy haram, is the land of Judah in the book of Jeremiah. Says this, and He's going to utterly destroy. Well, He says that it's only going to be for 70 years that the villages are left utterly desolate, and basically the people of Judah survive that. They go into exile, but then they come back. So that's something to keep in mind. There's extensive exaggeration. You can have people who are utterly destroyed, haram, but many people continuing to survive. And that's just the language of Joshua and Judges in particular. But when you get to Deuteronomy, I'll give an example of this. It's very interesting that as you read the accounts of the killing of the kings, of Sihon and Og in the book of Numbers, we're told that the kings, their sons, and the army are destroyed. But Deuteronomy hypes up the rhetoric, and in chapters 2 and 3, when referring back to that historical event, refers to men and women, young and old, everyone is destroyed. But in the kind of straightforward narrative, we're told that it was just the adult males who were killed. So you have that picture, and Deuteronomy just adds to that kind of strong, language, and then of course 1 Samuel picks up on that with the Amalekites. Saul is described as having utterly destroyed the Amalekites, but there are, of course, many Amalekites who are left. And at the end of the book, David is fighting against another army of the Amalekites. So again, not literally true, even though the narrator tells us that Saul utterly destroyed the Amalekites. So there's a lot more going on here. And so we have to be very careful about simply dismissing this language as, oh, look at this genocidal, this is total annihilation. That's not how the rhetoric was viewed in the ancient Near East, and so we need to respect that kind of genre as we look at these.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the things that actually like blew my mind when I read the book. I was like, oh yeah, that makes so much sense. I guess I never put two and two together on some of those things because I just remember the Amalekites kept coming up when I was a kid. So it was funny that you pointed that. I'm like, oh, that's so obvious. It's almost, and when I read and thought about this, it's almost like when we say that our football team went out there and we owned them. Well, we don't literally own them. If you take that literally and you rip it out of its context of 21st century young person talk or whatever, you didn't actually own them. You just beat them or crushed them. It even crushed. You didn't literally crush them. So people are, when this language is used, we really do need to go back into the hermeneutic, really try to understand it historically speaking, contextually. Was it trying to convey? Were you going to say something? Sorry, you almost looked like you were going to.
Yeah, I was just going to say it was kind of ancient Near Eastern trash talk. So that's what we're dealing with here. And you look at other, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, they use this, the Babylonians, they use that same sort of trash talk. And we know from history that even when they said that Israel was utterly, was non-existent, or the Egyptians turning some people to ashes, again, not literally true, but again, uses that hyped up language. And again, Deuteronomy picks up on that kind of hyperbolic language that looks like, oh, something utterly sweeping, utterly devastating. But it's something much more modest.
And that makes sense. And I think that really will, that alone, because one of the number one objections I get as a pastor and an apologist is the genocidal discussion. So that was immensely helpful. And then as I looked into it over the past about year and a half, I've really realized, historically speaking, it's what happened. Sometimes they say we utterly destroyed their men, women, and children, and they took out like a military outpost, which no women or children would be at. So exactly. I have found it very helpful. So the other thing that people bring up against the God of the Old Testament, and like I said, there is a lot of things we could talk about in the Old Testament. So people who are listening or watching, if you're kind of wondering how we could, square some of these circles, we're not going to be able to cover everything, okay? There's a lot in the Old Testament, which is why you need to read some of the books coming out and the books that have come out. But one of the other things that people bring up is like God's arbitrariness. Like, he just has all these weird commands. Why this? Why that? And one of the things that people bring up the most is kosher laws. Why in the world did God care about what they ate? That's so weird. Why can't you eat shrimp? Shrimp is delicious. Things along that nature. So would you mind commenting on just like the dietary laws by chance?
Sure. As we look at the Mosaic Law, we see that the laws cover a number of different facets of life, from diet to clothing to planting in your fields to sexual relations and so forth. Why is this important? Well, God was concerned about every facet of their lives, that their lives reflected their own distinctiveness from the surrounding nations. Of course, God created everything good at the very beginning. So it's not as though shrimp or pork are inherently sinful and or there's something inherently problematic with eating them. As we read later on, Jesus declared all foods clean. But for the people of Israel, there were certain identity markers that set them apart from the surrounding nations, that they were to be distinctive in how they lived, and that there were certain indicators that they belonged to a distinctive people. And even if these laws were temporary, like kosher laws or clothing laws or something like that, they still had a purpose in reminding the people that in their daily lives, they were to reflect their own identity as God's covenant people. So as they're putting on their clothing, as they're engaging in sexual relations, man and wife, that they are doing so under the blessing of God, under the guidance of God, and they're to be God's distinct people, so that when the people, and Deuteronomy picks up on this, when people looked at the laws of Moses and saw how the people lived, they would say, what a wise people they are. It would reflect on the greatness of God who had people living like this. So they're very distinctive. But there's also something symbolic about the kosher laws beyond this. When you look at the kinds of, there are two categories that I think are noteworthy. One is where an animal does not fit within its particular typical sphere. You have, say, the birds of the air, the fish of the sea, and the land animals. But when you have something that's mixed, kind of like an eel, it looks like it should be a fish, but it doesn't have scales. It doesn't fit within that typical sea creature or sea animal, sphere. And so it was to be off limits for that reason. Why? Because the people of Israel were to be in their own particular sphere as the people of God, in contrast to the sphere of the surrounding nations. Secondly, a number of the animals that were considered off limits, that were not to be eaten by the people of Israel, were predatory animals, that they were devouring other animals, the vultures or hawks or something like that. These were off limits. Why? Because they're predatory. And perhaps even here having a kind of symbolic picture of not eating those animals that are predatory upon others. And so you eat, or say, domesticated animals or something like, or deer and so forth. So you have those types of distinctions as well. I can go into more details, but those are some fundamental distinctions that I think are helpful as we process what is behind those laws. And so even if they are seemingly arbitrary, like certain food laws that are later on negated, or that are that all food is all meat is now permissible. For a time, it had a purpose. That it's okay for certain things to have a purpose for a time, even if it doesn't have permanent relevance or significance. So I like to tell about how when my kids were younger, I would say, okay, kids, hold my hand when we're crossing the street. Well, now that they're in their 20s and early 30s, I don't say, okay, kids, hold my hand when we're crossing the street. It had relevance when they were younger, but now the relevance is no longer with them. In fact, one of these days they might say, Dad, hold my hand when we're crossing the street. So again, this seeming arbitrariness, it has a certain purpose for a time, but then once that purpose is served, then they're no longer relevant. It's kind of like a booster rocket. The law of Moses is kind of like this booster rocket that is important, has its place in the formation of the people of God. But when Christ comes, when the fulfillment of that law comes, then it's like that booster rocket falls off. It's no longer relevant as the identity markers for the people of God, because there's something now greater, and one has fulfilled that role. Jesus is the end of the law, Romans 10:4 tells us. So he's not only the goal of that law, but also the cessation of that law as the covenant that is to mark the people of God. We're no longer under the Sinai covenant.
That was actually the dietary laws one I found just very fascinating when I've looked into it. And a friend of mine pointed out that it's also interesting that the very first command given in Scripture was a kosher law. And he's a Messianic Jew, and he was like, yeah, first thing God says, don't eat that. They ate of it. Now kosher laws are a thing too, just kind of an ironic parallel. And then also you had mentioned, like, as far as, and I just wanted to clarify for people who aren't tracking as far as the kosher law thing, was when you mentioned, like, the eel, it doesn't have scales like the rest of the fish, so therefore it's unclean. Or a crab got legs, so therefore it's not a standard sea creature like a fish. And then also maybe like pigs with the different types of hooves and all that. They're not what you consider a non-predatory standard land animal. When you discuss that, I thought it was interesting that you said that kind of harkens back to the creation account a little bit, right? Like where it's like, here are standard land animals, standard water animals, and standard air animals, all these different things, and then all the life-giving stuff, hence why not the predatory. And that's kind of and not life-taking, but life-giving kind of idea. So there's a lot more symbology, I think, than people understand in the kosher laws. They just look at it at face value and just wonder and just go, oh, well, this is just kosher laws and God is arbitrary. And it's not. There's more symbology there. Also, that's the first time I've ever heard anyone describe the law of Moses as a rocket. That was...
Yeah. I actually borrowed that from N.T. Wright, who used that language of the law of Moses being a booster rocket, which I found very helpful.
I enjoyed that. I'm not going to lie. I was kind of like, oh, that's funny. N.T. Wright. Yeah. Oh, wow. That's somebody I should try to discuss with sometime. I enjoy some of his work. So anyway, thank you for that. Those are just some of the main questions that I think people have. That's why when I reached out to you to have you on, I wanted you to kind of just explain some of the big things, and then also why people need to read this and why people do need to try to get into the context. Now, before we close here, because we're about nearing the end of our time, I ask every single guest this, and it's not really a huge curveball. I think it can help. You would be helpful with this. So we call ourselves the Church Split here, and that's because we discuss divisive issues in the church and culture today, and we try to do so in a spirit of unity, with a spirit of decency, without a lot of animosity and things like that when divisive issues come up. So my question is how do you think your work and what you're doing with your ministry can help unite the divided body? I know it's way off kilter than what we've been talking about. That's a curveball.
Yeah. Well, I hope the tone in which this is written is something that encourages discussion, encourages engagement, that it doesn't, turn away people, treat them as opponents, ideological opponents, unworthy of discussion. I really want to encourage the dialogue. I want to encourage engagement. And so I contributed to a book written by a group of new theists who are responding to the new atheists, wanting to do so in a manner that is gracious, that points out some of the things that they are right in pointing out, but also seeking to build bridges and get past some of the rhetoric and emotive language that is used to substantive discussion. So that's something that I believe is important for us to engage in. And also, I think that a lot of Christians who have been perhaps turned off to some of the challenges in the Old Testament, who say, oh, I can't believe in a God like that. I want to say, well, hey, have you considered this? Have you looked more closely at that to help them to maybe revisit some of those things that they have perhaps cast off from early years, from misunderstandings of the text, to say, no, maybe there's another way of looking at these things. Not that that there isn't any severity with God. You have severity with Jesus, but you're also very much reminded that God is one who behind as one hymn puts it, behind God's frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. That there is ultimately, wrath is not something that is central to the character of God. Wrath is something that is a contingent quality. Love is at the heart of who God is. God is triune in loving relation, Father, Son, and Spirit, and God is loving toward us. And so we need to understand that fundamentally at the heart of God's character is love. And yes, there is wrath and so forth, but keep coming back to what is fundamental to who God is, namely his love as revealed in Jesus Christ. The one who has seen me, Jesus said, has seen the Father. Jesus can be wrathful, driving out money changers from the temple, but yet you fundamentally see a God who loves his enemies, gives himself for them, is fully expressed in Jesus' death on the cross. So that's where I want people to look, where I want them to be pointed, and to say, let's keep the main
Absolutely.
thing the main thing.
I think that's great. I can't agree more with that than the fact that there's this people. That's kind of the thing I've noticed with progressive Christianity, right? So they have to find, like, when you get to progressive Christianity, like in California and whatnot, they have to find new workarounds of the Old Testament. And then they have to just say, well, it was written by sinful people. It's not really the full words of God. They're just people writing things down and God's in there, but people corrupted it. There's like this weird ideology in progressive Christianity because they shy away from those things without maybe going, maybe I'm missing something. And not so much that the Bible is wrong or the God is evil or the prophets were wrong. So I just thank you so much for that. This is very valuable work. I think many Christians, and if you haven't, those who are listening listening or watching, please pick up Is God a Moral Monster? Check out other books by Dr. Paul Copan. He is very helpful. Obviously, you could tell in this interview, he's very polite. He's not bombastic, and he tries to just be as honest and forthcoming as possible. So with that being said, Dr. Copan, is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, I just want to say thanks so much for the opportunity to be with you, Will, and appreciate the connection, and wish you well.
Well, I appreciate that,
ministry.
and hopefully it'll all go well according to plan. So thank you for being on. If you guys haven't already, like and subscribe to The Church Split.
And go ahead and leave a 5-star review if you haven't already. And guys, if you have gone through a church split or anything like that, please feel free to email us at thechurchsplit@gmail.com. We would love to have a conversation with you on the channel where you can talk about how that affected you and your church. So anyway, hopefully this podcast brings you some sense of unity, and that you find that we can be united on the main thing. As Dr. Copan said, let's keep the main thing the main thing. So let's just keep doing that. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to The Church Split. Take care.